Fall, 1864. Atlanta has fallen. The Confederacy is desperate for a victory. Only a few months earlier, General John Bell Hood had been appointed to command the Confederate Army of Tennessee after Lieutenant General Joe Johnston had been fired from that command by President Jefferson Davis. Davis feared Johnston would give up Atlanta, the massive depot and supply hub for the Southern armies, without a fight. When Hood takes charge, he orders a series of offensive actions against the advancing Federal troops commanded by William T. Sherman. Although limited tactical success is wreaked on various parts of the field, nothing can stop the massive numbers thrown against the Confederate Army of Tennessee. On September 1, 1864, Atlanta was evacuated by Confederate forces, and Federal troops moved in to occupy the city. The Confederate Army has been devastated by high casualty rates and attrition from desertion over the last few months. At a council of war in September 1864, after a reorganization of the Army, the commanders decide only a forward movement can maintain cohesion within the Army. John Bell Hood was a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, class of 1853. He had risen rapidly through the ranks and had great success as both a brigade commander and division commander earlier in the war. At the Battle of Gettysburg, he had lost the use of his left arm when he was hit by a shell fragment. And only 2.5 months later, he was wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga, September 1863, being shot in the upper right thigh, which resulted in the amputation of that limb. He was sent to Richmond to recover, and by May 1864, President Davis had promoted him to Corps Command within the Army of Tennessee. The Atlanta campaign began the same month, and Hood hardly had 2.5 months to prove himself a good Corps commander, something that he in fact would fail to really do. Now Davis had entrusted him with an entire army to command, and Hood had little knowledge of the logistics of even an infantry corps. But Hood was not alone. Following the evacuation of Atlanta, William J. Hardee, a longtime Corps commander in the Army, had requested and was granted a transfer. Leonidas Polk's death 3 months earlier had also created a need for a new Corps commander. In fact, all three of Hood's primary subordinates were nearly as new to their jobs as Hood was to his. Lieutenant General Alexander P. Stewart also graduated the United States Military Academy at West Point. He rose rapidly through the ranks with excellent performances at Shiloh and Perryville. He was given command of Polk's former corps. Lieutenant General Stephen D. Lee had graduated from West Point as well. He had seen service in the Eastern Theater and served with cavalry as well as artillery. Lee assumed command of General Hood's former corps. Hood's final subordinate commanded Hardee's old corps. Major General Benjamin Franklin Cheatham had no formal military education, but had served as a colonel in the Mexican War and as a major general of Tennessee militia in the years preceding the war. Cheatham had bonded strongly with his men and was well known for his hard-hitting Tennessee division. These three corps commanders, as well as the commanding general, had less than 3 months' experience when it was determined to move north towards Tennessee. September and October took the Army west and north of Atlanta in an attempt to lure Sherman from his fortifications for an open field fight. Sherman, however, would not have it. There were more important tasks at hand than to chase Hood and his army through North Georgia. Instead, Sherman detached General George Thomas to command a force that would protect Middle Tennessee. Under Thomas's command, General John Schofield would lead a force composed of the 4th and 23rd Army Corps. It would take weeks to transport the Federal Army's men and material by rail to Middle Tennessee, and if the Confederates were to take advantage of the situation, they would have to move with rapidity. As fate would have it, logistics caused a nightmare for the Confederate Army. After arriving at Florence, Alabama in late October, only a trickle of supplies had made it to that point, the point from which the Tennessee campaign should truly kick off in earnest. For 3 weeks, the rebel army sat idle, while the Federal 4th and 23rd Corps moved into blocking positions in Middle Tennessee. It wasn't until November 21st that the Confederate Army took their first steps in the advance to Nashville. Dividing his army on three different axes of advance, Hood marched rapidly towards Columbia after discovering a massing of Federal army at Pulaski, more than 30 miles south of Columbia. Just as Confederate cavalry under General Nathan Bedford Forrest arrived on the outskirts of Columbia, Federal infantry rushed into the city. The Federals had successfully secured Columbia. Confederate infantry arrived on the outskirts of Columbia on November 26. With Duck River to their back and nestled in the town, Hood saw that he may be able to cross the river to the east and envelop the Federal army on the north side of Duck River. He issued plans to his corps commanders on the evening of the 27th at the Warfield house south of Columbia. That night, however, the entire Federal army crossed over to the north side of Duck River. Although it was somewhat of a disappointment, the plan overall would not change. Before dawn on the morning of November 29, 1864, Confederate infantry moved into positions to cross Duck River east of Columbia and conduct a forced march to cut off the Federal army at or near Spring Hill. Now was set in motion one of the biggest blunders and one of the most controversial events of the American Civil War.